Hey, this is Dean Walker again, the host of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, which many of you who will be watching this particular video will be watching it on the Poetry of Predicament channel on YouTube. And thank you for watching. And this is meant to just give you a sense of one small part of kind of the ultimate support group that we've got available for folks in the Living Resilience Deep Academy online learning series and support groups and so on. And it's this particular support group, this kind of advanced level support group, we call it the community of practice. And just really pleased that you will join us as much as you are going to in this series of videos that I'm sharing, both, of course, in the community of practice, and then for those of you who are just curious about what are some of the topics that we cover and how do we do that and so on. So this is the second in a series about grief and soul. And why grief? Well, because grief seems to be a weak suit in many of the business as usual cultures. And I'd say the top of the heap in terms of not doing grief very well is the USA. We are horrid at it collectively, in my judgment. And so that's one of the reasons that we're putting together this series for this 10-week stretch of the community of practice. And soul, one of the ways we talk about collapse of Earth and human systems is that it is really a predicament, and it's a human-caused predicament. And one of the main causes is that we've disconnected both voluntarily and consciously, and involuntarily and unconsciously. We've disconnected from all the primary sources of meaning and relationship in a human life. It's a pretty bold assertion, I know, but what's at the core of our work. And the disconnection is from those primary sources of meaning and relationship. For conversation's sake, we break them into a particular set of categories. That would be deeper self, connection with others, connection with the earth, and connection with soul. So deeper self, others, earth, and soul. And most people, when we give them the basic rundown of what we see in terms of how we frame this work, they get it about deeper self and others and earth, but soul is so encumbered with particularly religious connotations and so on, and that is clearly not the way we frame the use of the word soul here in Living Resilience Deep Academy and in the community of practice process work. It's something that's pretty well described in the first of the series. So you could go back to the first in this series, and there's some amount of description and definition there. There will be more as each of these sessions unfolds. For now, let's say that there's a really good reason why we've got this interview with Francis Weller, and that's supported with a number of his writings and so on in the community of practice, in the kind of resources that we're using in this series. And I consider Francis Weller quite a guide and a mentor and a wise elder with regards to all things regarding this type of soul, and in grief as well. So he's a psychotherapist, he's an incredible workshop facilitator, and he's most proud of what he calls himself a soul activist. And for all the times that I've been in workshops with Francis, I've really not quite gotten what that role is that he's talking about, but that's a whole nother story. So in this second episode of this series that I'm sharing with you, there's he's going to keep revisiting the topic of a rough initiation. There are those who are saying, well, humanity is going through a dark night of the soul. Humanity is going through an initiation. And what he means by rough initiation is something that's truly, this is at the heart of the lineage that I learned about initiation in, is that it needs to be held by wise elders. It needs to be held by people who have specifically the capacity to hold, to stage and hold and carry out all the elements of an initiation process, for instance, from younger children to adulthood, and then from adults to elderhood, and so on. And we don't have that. Certainly on a global scale, and in the USA, we don't have it on a national scale. I'm unaware of any of the industrialized countries that have anything remotely like a container for that kind of large scale initiation. And there are very few instances of the smaller communities or groups that are able to hold that. So what we are left with is the rough initiation. You'll be hearing more about that in each of these segments. There's this idea of initiation, and just plain old initiation. It requires a number of steps if you're going to be, working at in the name of the lineage that Francis is talking about. He talks about a radical severance from the familiar. And in our case, it means that it's being demanded of that we release our intense collective focus on the individual, on individualism in our culture, particularly in the USA and in the hyper-developed industrial world. It really implies each of us being more permeable, more able to assimilate larger and larger experiences of being alive, and deeper experiences of being alive, and an interrelatedness between ourselves and others, and ourselves and Earth. And of course, we will be hearing by the end about our connection with soul. There's a really prime piece in this particular short excerpt from this longer interview that makes up the core of each of these videos in the series. One of the core elements is that an initiation of any kind, and particularly the rough kind that we are in, it really is demanding that we get used to the idea of not knowing, that we create some kind of a level of willingness and mutual support to be able to lean into not knowing. And that is, as we all know, that is one of the weakest suits of industrialized culture. So there's a particular term that Francis brings up for us. It's called Kartsa Looney. Kartsa Looney. He'll spell it for you and he'll tell you about it. And it's a particularly sharp contrast. Just this term and what it means is so very different than anything that I've ever experienced at scale in our culture. It's sitting together quietly in the dark, waiting for something unexpected to happen. Kartsa Looney, sitting together quietly in the dark, waiting for something unexpected to happen. It's an extraordinary concept and an extraordinary process. It's just something that a group of people, a tribe, and so on would intentionally put themselves into that state in a dark place, waiting for something unexpected to happen. So that's just a preview of coming attractions in this particular segment. Francis is always also going to introduce you to something that he's spent extensive time in his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. Talks about the 5 gates of grief. Goes far beyond the one that we seem to give ourselves in this culture, which is, I'm sorry for your loss if you've lost a relative or a dear person in your life, or a pet, or a, something of great importance to you. Certainly we have at least that, but he opens it up to 4 more gates of grief. So I think you can look forward to that. I'd like to invite you to stay with this, meaning you've probably already gotten a sense of Francis's pacing. It's a bit slower. I certainly try to get into that rate of presentation and speaking in these videos, because the rate of speed of soul, I've heard it said in a quite beautiful way, it moves at the speed of trust. And that's a good way that I get to scan out in the world and just gauge how are we doing collectively with regard to our connection with soul. And if I look out at the USA right now, we are desperately short on trust. And of course, that leads into a severe shortage of connection with soul. So I would invite you to take your time, maybe even play this a couple times for yourself. Each of these segments has just enough without being too overburdening with, an hour-and-a-half video or that sort of thing. I would invite you to dig into some of the prompts that we'll put either in the show notes or at the tail end of an episode of these videos. I would invite you to create your own journaling prompts, your own conversation prompts, if you're lucky enough to have someone with whom you can talk about this work, talk about this conversation, talk about this commitment to re-enlivening our sense of soul in life. Again, I'm just really thankful for all of you on YouTube who are deciding to chime in with us, watch these videos in series with us. There'll be one weekly for the next 3 or 4 weeks, and possibly more. We'll see how the flow goes. And in each of the show notes, you'll also find a number of links to further resources that both the community of practice members have brought to share, and also that are mentioned by Francis or Michael Lerner in the interview. So hope you enjoy this next segment of Francis Weller talking about our rapid immersion in rough initiation.
Like that. There's optimism, there's hope, and then there's depression, and then there's this vision that you take of, yes, this is the long dark, but I mean something different by the long dark than despondency and depression.
I do.
Yeah. So let's go further into that, because you talked about this entry into the long dark as a rough initiation. And in the cancer help program, you would also say to the participants, cancer has been a rough initiation for you.
Right.
So say more about how, because this isn't just an individual thing, right?
No.
And not for everybody, not for the techno-optimists, not for, all people who are, all excited about the U-turn economy or believe that we're going to figure it out one way or another. It's going to get better, right? Say more about, for those who are grieving this age of extinctions and grieving this metamorphosis, which we can't stop, how can we navigate ourselves in this great unraveling, to use that poetic term? How can we navigate in the great unraveling in order to move ourselves through the dark toward a rich, textured soul life?
You get 10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay. All right, I'll do my best. First, let me just say these are difficult topics, okay? There is potential for a lot of panic, grief, fear, anxiety. So I just want to invite you all to just monitor your own bodies right now as we talk about this material, because it can be overwhelming. We're facing some utterly overwhelming material on the planet. So just be careful and be sensitive to your own body and heart and soul right now, okay? The reason I like the term, the idea of the long dark, is that certain things can only happen in the dark. I'm a big fan of alchemy. And alchemy talk about different phases of the work of the alchemical process. And one of the phases is called the negredo, the blackening. And the blackening is a period that actually is required in order for soul to be given shape. That soul work can't even begin until there's been a blackening. And I bet you everyone in this, I was going to say room, what do we call this? This tent, the big tent.
The tent of meeting.
The tent of meaning, and also all of you online. I bet you every one of us has had times where we felt this pall of darkness come over us, and we were taken down to our knees. We felt incredibly vulnerable or broken or lonely or sad. We might not even know why. Well, we're in a collective dark night of the soul right now. And there's purpose to that. There's meaning in that. There's work that can only go on in the dark, of letting go of old paradigms, old structures, old ideologies. There's typically a kind of a bifurcated response to any radical circumstance. One of them is, how do I collaborate with what is happening in the collective psyche? The other one is to resist it at all costs and to fortify the old structures. And we're seeing that right now in our experience in the United States. There's a lot of reification of old patterns and old ideologies of dominance and control. Okay. That might give some sense of security, but the long run, that's not going to get us across this threshold of change. That's why the image of the rough initiation is so valuable. Initiation basically initiates three things. One of them is there's a radical severance from the world that we once knew. And that's what we're experiencing. I think COVID was kind of the warm-up band. It's kind of recognizing that we have left the ordinary world. The second thing that happens in initiation is that there's a radical change in your sense of identity. I think part of the hidden grace of COVID is that it's loosened the fiction of individualism. We're all in this together. No matter what you think, we're all being affected by this. And it's not just me anymore, handling my own individual life. We are in this collectively. So my sense of identity has begun to loosen and to become more permeable. I'm connected to you and to you and to you and everything else around me. This is a quick aside, but I was going to bed one night just before the election, full of despair. I was just depressed that we were going to repeat the same choices. And something, just as I was about to crawl into bed, something turned my body around and took me back to one of my bookshelves and reached up, pulled a collection of essays off by Linda Hogan, who is a Chickasaw elder author. And I opened the book to all my relations. And I realized at that moment I had forgotten all my relationships. I forgot that I was entangled with the stars and the moon and the owls outside and the lichen and the trees and the turtles. And I forgot that. And the moment I remembered those filaments of connection, the despair began to lift. Part of what I think we have to do in the long dark is remember how incredibly entangled we are with everything. That nothing exists outside of our relationship to it. We're always inside of it. I have no idea if I'm close to the question you asked or not, but
We're not here to answer questions.
okay, that's true. Did I get my 10 minutes in? Is that anything else we want to say about that?
Well, first of all, I think that's a beautiful response.
There's one more thought. Part of what I love about the long dark, if we can love that, is that it invites us into the territory of not knowing. There's a beautiful word in the Inuit tradition called Kartsa Looney. Anybody ever hear that word, Kartsa Looney? Qarrtsiluni, Kartsa Looney. And the word means sitting together quietly in the dark, waiting for something unexpected to happen. Wow. We're not going to figure our way out of this one. I don't think. I think the problems are way too complex. But I think we can sit together quietly in the dark and become receptive to some new imagination, some new image, some new metaphor, something that begins to catch a glint of where we might need to walk together. This practice in the Inuit tradition is done before every hunting season because they have to wait until they get the song of the whale before they can go and ask it to sacrifice its life. So they have to sit quietly in the dark and wait until the next whale song is given to them. I think that's where we are. We must learn how to sit in the darkness together and not try to heroically figure this out, but to become patient enough to listen to the dreaming earth. What if the earth is a gigantic dreaming creature and we've stopped listening in our arrogance, in our hubris? What if we began to listen again to the dream of the earth, as Thomas Berry would call it, as many traditional cultures would call it? The earth is a dreaming creature. And so we have to slow down enough to practice that togetherness, which is, I also think, another one of the healing elements of what's happening right now is that we are beginning to question the ideology of my individualistic life, that it's not true.
Many people here today and many people listening now or who will listen in the future, the grief about the earth is real, but foreground for many people in many situations is grief about their individual situations and losses. And in your book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, you have an extraordinary set, which I think might be useful to introduce here, about the different forms that grief takes. So could you just introduce us to those gates, or whatever we should call them, because then we can weave those gates into the conversation.
Yes, I sat with many, many hundreds and hundreds of people in grief rituals. You begin to hear all the different ways grief occupies our beings. We're familiar with the first gate of grief, which was losing someone or something that you love. And that's the only grief that really is acknowledged culturally. That's the grief when someone can say to you, I'm sorry for your loss, or I heard that your marriage dissolved, or, I'm sorry to hear that. We get that grief reflected back to us. The other four gates of grief almost receive no attention at all. The second gate of grief is the parts of us that have never known love. And we all have pieces of our lives that were either shamed or not welcomed in our families or our religious situations or educational situations. And so we had to cleave off parts of our being. We couldn't be angry, or we couldn't be sad, or we couldn't be too exuberant, we couldn't be too sensual, or we couldn't be too exuberant. Whatever it was, we were told pretty clearly what an acceptable self looks like. And so because the need to belong is so great, particularly as a child, we will shape a self that matches the expectations. And we will cleave these parts off. The problem is that these parts of us that we cut away from us, we don't just do that neutrally. We begin to adapt the same attitude towards these parts of us that they were treated with. So we hold them with contempt. I remember going to my therapist when I first started really seriously going to therapy. The first thing out of my mouth to Michael was, Michael was my therapist, not Michael. But, the first words out of my mouth was, I want you to help me get rid of some parts of me. As if these were despicable pieces of me. Weakness, neediness, my sensitivity. These are all despicable parts of me. I had to get rid of them. And of course, I failed miserably at the task, thankfully, because these are the parts that made me most human. The redemption of these outcasts was the healing. The problem is we can't grieve for something that we hold with contempt. So much of therapy is really about repairing the relationship to what has been outcast and beginning to make amends to these parts of ourselves that we've learned to judge and shame and reject. Third gate of grief is the sorrows of the world. And this one is becoming more and more what comes into the grief gatherings. It's becoming more and more what comes into my office every day. I'm hearing less and less about personal histories and more terror and grief about what's happening in our neighborhood, what's happening to our culture, what's happening to the planet. In fact, I think the patient is now the planet. That's not me. So the sorrows of the world are becoming more and more weighted in our psyches. And if you pay any attention at all, you feel the sorrows of the world most any given day. The fourth gate of grief is what we expected and did not receive. This one, I didn't even know how to name it. But when we would gather in circle and we would sing together and dance together and weep together and share food and all that, people began talking using the language of village. Oh, I wish I had a village like this. And you begin to recognize that we all long for that. We all came here, as R.D. Lang said, we all come here as Stone Age children. We all arrive here with the same set of expectations that we had 200,000 years ago. To wake up in the morning and see this many pairs of eyes looking back at you and asking you what you dreamt last night and going out to gather firewood and that tonight there's going to be stories around the fire. And that's what we expected, and almost none of it materialized. And so in this great absence, which we tend to blame ourselves for, like, what did I do wrong that I feel so empty, that I feel so lonely? I must have done something wrong, because there is this expectation of fullness. But what if it's not your personal failure, but a cultural amnesia, I say the two primary sins of Western culture are amnesia and anesthesia. We forget and we go numb. And you go numb in part because of what we've forgotten. So when we gather together for a grief ritual, I say, isn't it strange we need a workshop on grieving? But we could say the same thing, well, isn't it strange we need a workshop on creativity? Or on relationships and love, or on, being in our bodies. What we're talking about is this great amnesia. What it is we've forgotten how to be human beings. So that's the fourth gate of grief. And the last gate of grief is what I call ancestral grief. And this one, the more I sit with ancestral grief, the more I realize that I think all griefs are ancestral grief. That my wounds have to do with shame and feeling unworthy, that I felt somehow my family did not see me. But where did that story begin? How many generations back can I go when that loss began to really settle into my family lineage? So in some ways, what I'm grieving is ancestral. What I'm grieving didn't begin now. It began, as Rumi would say, in some other tavern. It began a long time ago, when we began to sift out of being embedded in a living cosmology between people, planet, and place. And we began to become more and more focused on the individualistic ideology. And we began to kind of sever ourselves from that. And the other part of this ancestral grief is what happened when a lot of our European ancestors arrived here on this continent, to the traditional peoples on this planet. And then the importation of slavery. And we've never reconciled those griefs. We've never even addressed those griefs. So we're still, as a culture, struggling with the unmetabolized grief of over 400 to 500 years of colonization and domination. And that's where we are right now. So those are the